Hello, and welcome back to another episode of McKill's Deck Chronicles. It is a podcast that has conspiracies and other things from coast to coast. My name is Kenny, and I'm going to be talking to you today about White Alice. And in case you are wondering what that is, I'm going to explain that to you. Now, some people are going to know what that is, but a lot of people have never heard of it. So, White Alice is a communication system. Okay, it's called the White Alice Communication System, and it was implemented by the U.S. Air Force, okay, as a telecommunication network with 80 radio stations, and they were all placed in Alaska at that time. So that's what they did, is they put all these stations up in Alaska. Okay, these sites consisted of what looks to be like a satellite dish. Okay, and I say what looks to be like a satellite dish because this was an era before satellites in outer space. So they couldn't be using those, right? So what's funny about this thing is they look an awful lot like a regular satellite dish, but they actually started putting these things together in the early 1950s, okay, before NASA, before rocket ships, and before so-called satellites in outer space. So let me give you a picture here of what one of these things looks like. So here we go. This is an example of one that's sitting on a hill, and it has a send and receive station there. So one of the satellites, or one of these dishes, would receive a signal, and one could transmit a signal. You can see the building there next to it, and a regular building. So these are really, really big dishes. Now, I don't know if you remember, if you're old enough to have seen the dishes that the movie channels came on years ago, but those dishes were enormous. I mean, they were 8 feet wide, 10 feet wide, something like that. And they would take those dishes and aim them up, and you'd get your TV stations. Now, of course, we still have dishes like that. Dish Network, for example, is a satellite TV network. And so we still have it. It's just a lot smaller dish. Okay? We've all seen a Dish Network or a DirecTV dish on the side of somebody's house. So you know what I'm talking about. But before those dishes, we had the White Alice dishes. Okay? Let me give you another picture here of a White Alice dish. There's two of them. Excuse me. You can see the send and receive units in the middle sticking up off the ground, and they go into these discs, these satellite dishes, and you can see the building between them, and it's a big building. So these are really, really big. Okay, so that's what they look like. Supposedly, these things, it says the system connected remote Air Force sites in Alaska, and it had something to do with the distant early warning line, or the DEW line, which supposedly they were worried about somebody coming in over Alaska and attacking United States of America, so they had to have communications with Alaska. Okay. So also, these things were used for civilian phone calls, so you could make phone calls over these things. Okay. It says the system was advanced at that time, but it became obsolete within 20 years following the advent of satellite communications. So the only thing I can figure here is what they're calling a satellite communications means that there is supposedly a satellite in outer space. Okay. So let's do the background on these things. How do they work? Well, let's see. It was conceived in the early 1950s. Alaska only had a basic telephone communication system. So they're saying, for example, prior to this White Alice communication system, only one phone call at a time could be placed from Nome, Alaska to Fairbanks, Alaska. So apparently they didn't have very good phone service back then, obviously. So it says communication improved after White Alice was installed. It says, but even in the mid-1960s, if an Anchorage, Alaska resident had to go downtown to place a call to anywhere else other than Alaska. Okay. So, let's see. This construction of this stuff began in 1955. The system was dedicated in 1958. It just so happens NASA was invented in 1958. Do you know what else came about in 1958? The Bermuda Triangle, the place where NASA sends all of its rockets. Okay, so the legend of the Bermuda Triangle and how dangerous it is was fabricated in 1958. This thing came online in 1958. NASA was came online in 1950. A lot of things are going on in the 50s, okay, in the late 50s. And I mentioned that in my Flat Earth book, by the way. So a lot of things happening here in the 50s. So anyway, let's see. What have we got here? So White Alice was designed by Western Electric. It was civilian contractors maintained it. In 1976, this thing was leased to RCA. And by the end of the 70s, most of the system was deactivated. So in other words, up into the 80s, this thing was still running. Okay, now, if you believe what the propagandists tell you, what NASA tells you, what current scientists tell you, then you would believe that there are satellites in outer space by then. So I don't know why they weren't using them, but they're still, maybe they had started supposedly. But anyway, this thing's still running up into the early 1980s because it said most of it was deactivated by the end of the 70s. So let's see here. Why did they call it White Alice? Well, it says in the 1950s that the Air Force used a 2-word code name, and White Alice was the code name selected for this project, possibly because white was used to indicate the snowy Arctic sites that this system would serve. However, it's unclear where they got Alice from. So probably Alice in the Wonderland, in my opinion, because it's Alice in Wonderland's fake as well. Now, I'm not saying these things are fake. Okay, I'm not saying that's at all that they're fake. How they claim they work, I think is fake. We're going to get to that. Okay, so let's go on here. I've got this little detailed thing about it. So we go on the construction. Let's see. United States Army Corps of Engineers built these things. And, let's see. Some of the sites were easily accessible. Most of the sites were far from civilization on remote and mountain peaks. And it says 14 tons of equipment were taken up by dog sled or helicopter to these sites to build these things. These things are massive. Some of them were actually lived in. The back of them was all enclosed, and they had computers and all kinds of stuff. Whatever they had back then, they had there. Now, these things were running. There was no electricity out there either. There's no phone lines. There's nothing out there. So this thing, let's see. They initially estimated that a single site would require 6 people and a 25 kilowatt generator to maintain this thing to keep it running. It says, however, each site ended up requiring 20 people and 180 kilowatt of electrical power to operate. So these things took 180 kilowatts. So that's a big generator. So they had diesel generators and fuel tanks. These things had to be placed. So they were constantly putting diesel in these things. These things, picture this. These things ran on diesel engines, okay, for 20 years. From the 50s up into the 80s, these things are running on diesel. So these things aren't cheap to run. Okay, this is this expensive little deal they're doing out here. You can imagine a diesel engine of that era probably wasn't a very efficient engine either. So here's the thing I wanted to get to. Now that we've kind of laid out what these things are, and I think I've showed you, here's a picture of one, okay, up close. It's just a giant dish. You can see the sending and receiving unit in front of it on a tower aimed to the center. Now, they're not very steeply angled up either. Okay, I've already shown you that one. I think that's it. Okay, so here's how they claim these things work. So we have no satellites in outer space. We have nothing, according to them. Of course, I know that's true too, because, of course, I don't believe they have the outer space. So before the outer space, the whole Star Trek thing comes online here. These things are sending and receiving signals for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And, they can't just go through the air because there's stuff in the way. So you can't shoot a radio signal 100 miles if there's mountains and buildings and everything. Obviously, it'll get disrupted. So they came up with the idea of aim this thing up, and they're claiming that this radio beam goes up and hits, well, that's just it. Now, here's the problem. It doesn't hit anything. It just reflects off of the air. And they claim that it reflects off of the air in what's called the troposphere. Okay? Now, I have a picture here of the little layers I want to show you. You can see at the bottom, this is layers of the atmosphere. You can see at the bottom there is the troposphere. That's where the airplanes fly. Okay? Then you've got the stratosphere, the mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere. And, of course, up in the exosphere, you've got your little satellites flying around, supposedly. Okay, so in the troposphere, you have nothing. You just have air. Okay? So they claim they can shoot a signal up to nothing, and it will bounce back down. They can send a signal, bounce it off nothing, and it will come back down to a receiver that received it, bounced off nothing. Now, if that sounds kind of weird and hard to believe, these are the same people who say the Earth was created from nothing. The solar system was created from nothing. There was nothing, and it exploded into something. Okay? So if I have nothing, if you have any brain in your head, okay, that hasn't already been ate out by something, you know that if you have nothing, you have nothing. Nothing is nothing. You can't have nothing and it turn into something. Everybody knows that. But according to our top scientists, okay, our top people that we have right now in 2025, they say that nothing exploded into something. In this case, exploded into everything. Planets, solar systems, outer space. And so nothing's pretty impressive to them. So does it come into any surprise that they claim that this system works off bouncing off of nothing? Okay, now if I wanted to bounce a radio signal off something, I would have to have something. If I wanted to bounce it off my wall, I have to have a wall. Okay? You're hearing my voice right now because the sound waves coming out of my mouth are bouncing off of a diaphragm in this microphone. But if I didn't have a microphone, if I had nothing, you would hear nothing. Okay? To me, that's common sense, but we can't do anything common sense. We have to do it. We have to do it the scientific way. So let's get back to their science. They call this thing the tropospheric scatter system. Okay, and what it does, it utilizes space, empty space, Okay, and it supposedly reflects signals off of air, off of nothing. Now, and it goes on to say the radio waves are scattered by the tropopause. So by the troposphere, it's scattered by, there's nothing there. So now I can see if you had like a lot of moisture in the air and, you can kind of ricochet something back down off of that. But these things were in operation steadily for over 20 years. Okay. And how these things work exactly is you have a signal going up, and we're going to use the top of the screen right here. It goes up and hits, let's say, whatever this is, and then it comes back down to the other side. Well, if you have a sending unit, okay, and you have a receiver, they never move. You saw those things. They're enormous. They are mounted in concrete. Okay, so they do not move. You can't tilt them or adjust them or anything. They are just there. So you've got one sending and one receiving. Okay, well, they're bouncing off of nothing because according to these scientists, the troposphere is here, but we go way up into outer space. So there's nothing there. There's no boundaries. There's nothing there. So it's bouncing beams off of nothing is what they claim. Okay. So they go on to say, and these beams are sent up and they scatter. And if you know the point where they hit, you can aim your dish at that point and you can receive this scatter. Okay, and that's what they're doing. So my question is what's in it? What's the difference from what they claim to be doing there and what they claim to be doing now? Think about this. You've got a dish aimed up towards the sky, and somewhere else, if you take another dish and you aim it to that coordinates, you can receive whatever it's sending out. So all you have to know is that point to where you're receiving back. Now, according to the scientists, that point is a satellite in outer space. Now, okay, let me show you a picture here how this works. So here is a very simple picture of satellites in outer space. As you can see, like on your left, you have a fixed contribution. So that's a signal going up. It's sending up and it's hitting a satellite, and the satellite is supposedly aiming it back down to a satellite on Earth. So this is the exact same thing they were doing, you see, with the White Alice, but you take the satellite out. So now we don't have a satellite. Instead, we have nothing. But here's what I really think's going on. They were sending the signal up all right, and it's bouncing back down. There's no doubt about that. But what's it bouncing off of? The firmament. Okay, they figured out that there is something up above us, and I don't know what it's made out of, and maybe they do and maybe they don't, but they figured out there's something up there, and it's at a certain height, and it's reflective. It's like glass. Now, the Bible describes it as molten looking glass, so that tells me it's reflective. It's like a molten, hard looking glass. Okay, so they figured this out, that they can shoot a signal up and hit this thing, and wherever they hit it, it bounces right back down to another location. And that is constant because the firmament's not changing. It's always there. It's in the same place. Nothing's moving. So they have figured out that if they shoot a signal up to that firmament, it will beam itself. It will bounce back down. You just have to know where it's bouncing down. So here's what I think is going on now. Now, they claim this White Alice is doing that very same thing, but it's not bouncing off the firmament. It's just bouncing off nothing. Okay, that's ridiculous. But now they claim that the White Alice is basically obsolete, and because satellites took its place. Well, here's what I think they did. Is what they do is over there in Alaska, for example, they still have satellites to communicate, satellite dishes. And they're still aimed up. It's just they're a whole lot smaller, and they've got way more bandwidth. So what I think they did is the technology increased where they can have a whole lot more information in a whole lot smaller area. Therefore, it doesn't require a big dish. Now, they still have a dish, and it's still being received. Okay, sending and received. But they claim now it's being intercepted by a satellite. Now, think about that for a second, monetarily wise. If you have a perfectly good reflective surface, like that White Alice worked on, you're not claiming it's the firmament, okay? You're just claiming it's reflective because you're a scientist, so you can't admit there's a firmament, okay? But you have something that's reflecting signals, and it does it good because this system worked for over 20 years. RCA was using it, okay? Think about that. Up into the 80s, early 80s. Maybe still using them. You know, they're not going to tell you everything. So this system worked. So why would you go and spend millions or billions of dollars on a satellite in outer space that simply takes your signal you're beaming up, and all it does is reflect it back down to your customer or whoever it is on the receiving end? You know, so this satellite takes millions to develop, millions to put into space, and probably millions supposedly to keep it going. And all it's doing is the exact same thing that you were already doing with none of that. So that doesn't make any sense, does it? It doesn't to me. So here's what I think happened. I think that there's a firmament. They discovered there's a firmament, and they know there's a firmament. The government has known it for many, many years, way back. Okay? So they figured out it's reflective. And they can shoot a radio beam up to it, and it will come back down in another location. And they have figured out that point that it hits and reflects, if you aim another dish at that point, you can receive it. Okay? They don't have to have a satellite in outer space to do this. It does it automatically. It's automatically a reflective surface. Because here's what they do now. They claim, for example, Dish Network. We're doing the same thing now. These people have got a dish on their house, okay, and Dish Network is sending and you're receiving. So let me show you a little deal on Dish Network here. This is Dish Network's facility, okay, one of their facilities. And let's see here. This is called an uplink site, a dish uplink. So what they're doing supposedly here is sending you all of your movies, everything that you watch on Dish Network. Okay? Now, do you notice these dishes are aimed in all different directions? You see that? There are quite a few different directions here. Now, I'm sure if you were to ask Dish Network, obviously they're going to claim that each one of those dishes are aimed at a satellite in outer space. Okay, if you can believe that. So what we have here, let's move that out of the way. So the Dish Network operates multiple uplink centers across the United States, according to them. And this manages their television services. So this particular one is located in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Okay. And it says, according to their little press release, that this center is notable for its extensive infrastructure, including enough cables to circle the Earth 6 times. Dish Network utilizes a fleet of satellites to deliver its television service across the United States. Let's see. As of the latest available information, Dish Network owns and leases a total of 14 satellites. Okay. So they claim to have satellites in outer space reflecting back down. I guess they call it transmitting. I don't know why you would need to receive a transmission from the ground and then retransmit another transmission to somebody else back on the ground when you can reflect the same thing. Okay, it doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, do I believe they have 14 satellites in outer space? No, I don't. Do I believe that are they reflecting it back down to you? Absolutely. They're reflecting it right off the firmament. Now, when the guy comes out to your house and he installs a satellite dish, is he in on it? No. No, he thinks there's satellites in outer space. Chances are. And they give him the coordinates. They'll say, hey, if you're in this area, we have 2 satellites reflecting back down our television. Okay, it's at west like 61 degrees and west 81 degrees at a certain latitude or longitude or whatever. So what you need to do as a technician is you take your dish and you know the general direction and you have a little meter. And as they move the dish, the meter tells you the signal, and you just keep moving it until you get the best signal. And once you get up to 50, 80%, whatever they consider acceptable, like say, well, let me try the other one. Let's try this other point. So they move the dish over here and like, oh, I got a better signal here. So you'll get better TV because I got a better signal. So they screw it all down and you've got your satellite. So all you're doing is receiving something that's being transmitted. They claim from outer space. I say it's reflected off the firmament. That's all it is. Okay. Now keep in mind, this system was working before satellites supposedly were ever invented. But hey, it's bouncing off of the air. Just off of nothing. So if you can bounce signals off nothing, I don't know why you'd bother putting 14 satellites in outer space. Okay. So now here's the other funny thing. Is the tropospheric scattering thing completely obsolete because it went out in the 80s? Well, according to some internet searching, the Army and the Marines still use it. In fact, here is a picture of a tropospheric scattering system used by the military. There it is. And that's what it's advertised as. So the only thing I could figure on something like this is, they're claiming they don't have satellites available, maybe. Maybe they don't have a satellite available at the time, so they can't do satellite communications when they're out in some remote area. So they're just aiming these dishes up, sending out a signal, and receiving it hundreds of miles away. It's the same thing as if you had a satellite, but you don't need a satellite. All you need is the troposphere. Well, I think that they're really bouncing the signal off of the firmament, if I had to guess. Okay? I believe that these satellites that are in geostationary orbit over the Earth, which means somehow they're hung wherever they're at and they just stay there. So they can aim a signal up and it will come back down. Now, we both know that if you're here on the planet Earth, right? Well, I say the planet. You're here on Earth because I don't believe Earth is a planet. You're here on Earth, okay? And you want to run a satellite system. You have to have it plugged into electricity. Okay. Now, we already know that the White Alice, for example, was out in the middle of nowhere, and these things were running on 180 kilowatt diesel engines to be able to transmit and receive, using thousands, probably tens of thousands. Over the years, probably hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel to run these things. Now we're doing it. Okay, in space, in outer space. In outer space, we don't need electricity to run anything. It runs itself. Oh, wait a second. We've got solar panels. We have solar panels on our satellite. So our satellite's running off solar energy in outer space. Now, you can read up about these satellites, and it takes actual fuel, according to them, to maintain its orbit. So it actually takes fuel. It has to burn it like a little rocket to keep it in space, to keep it in that space. We can go into that later. But I've got some information on that. It's also, in my opinion, about as dumb as it gets. But okay. So we've got satellites in outer space, and they run on nothing except the fuel source they took with them. And these things aren't very big, these satellites, okay? So they're not holding very much fuel. And they've got some solar panels. They do have solar panels, supposedly, okay? And these things are sitting up there for 15 to 20 years, just working. On, like an appliance, always on, accepting signals, processing them in the computer, and sending them back down. That way you can binge watch Netflix. You believe that, right? Now, here on Earth to run it, like back in the day, took diesel engines. Now, you've got to have it plugged into electric. You know, it has to be ran constantly. I mean, if you don't believe me, take your dish network and unplug it. Unplug it out of the wall and see how well it works. It's not going to work at all. Plug it into a satellite dish, not a satellite dish, a solar panel, and see how well it works. I mean, we've been trying to do this solar for a long time. I've got neighbors that are trying to do solar. Their whole house is covered in solar panels. Do you think they can turn their electricity off? Absolutely not. That solar is supposedly compensating and adding to. But the people that I know that have this stuff here, they say that the payment on the equipment is more than what the solar generates. Think about that. They spent, thousands, 50, 60, 70, whatever it cost, $1,000 for all of these solar panels on their house. And they have a 20 or 30 year payment note on this thing. And their payments is like, I don't know, $200, $300 a month. Okay, well, they don't even have that savings a month in electric, even on the sunniest, brightest days. If the whole month is sunny every single day, they don't produce enough electricity to make their monthly payments. So I don't know how that's helping you when your payment, it doesn't even make the payment on the thing. And this is a house with its whole entire roof covered in solar panels. And they can't even run the refrigerator on it. Nothing. Zero. Okay? I mean, and we've got a solar panel on a satellite in outer space, and it's providing all TV channels for, I don't know what, thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people. I mean, how many customers has Dish Network got? Millions? And they've only got 14 satellites, according to this deal. So each satellite's handling lots of people. That's a lot of TV. That's a lot of streaming. And this thing's sitting up in outer space with non-serviceable. You can't do anything with it. It's just sitting there, floating, whatever it's doing, But it's got all the power it needs. I mean, endless power for 20 years. I mean, what we need is that kind of a solar panel, apparently, down here on Earth. I mean, we clearly made it on Earth and supposedly sent it into outer space where it's working for 20 years, doing all this work flawlessly, doesn't need anything, doesn't need any maintenance, it needs nothing. Supposedly space is a very harsh environment. And we can, it's in outer space. That's why. Do you realize, that, like, for example, these solar panels here on Earth, okay, obviously they collect solar energy, right, from the sun. Well, it's a proven fact that these things get really, really hot. And the hotter they get, the less efficient they get. So when they're in the direct sunlight and the panel itself gets so hot you can't touch it, that it actually starts putting out less electricity because it's not as efficient if it's very hot. And obviously these solar panels are dark colored and they're sitting in the sun, so they get hot. So in the heat of the day, they actually get less efficient. They put out less electricity. Okay. Well, these panels are supposedly, let me show you the picture again. The solar panels on these satellites are in the exosphere, supposedly. Did you know that the exosphere gets up to 2,500 degrees Celsius? Did you know that's over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit? Think about that. You have a solar panel here on Earth, it gets 200 or 300 degrees sitting in the sun out here, and it starts crapping out on you. But we've got one out here in outer space, and just the environment it's in is, what was my number? 4,500 degrees? 4,500 degrees. Doesn't affect its efficiency at all. Works better than ever. Oh man, those things work good up there in that heat. Do you believe that? 4,500 degrees is where this satellite's at. Now, I'll tell you what, this podcast will go on forever if I covered everything. But let's just say, okay, Google what a satellite is supposedly made out of. Okay, I'm gonna give you some of them, but you can Google this yourself. Aluminum, titanium, magnesium. They supposedly got gold plating on their stuff so it doesn't corrode. Aluminum melts at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, turns into liquid. Now, this machine is supposedly operating where it's from 1,200 to 2,500 degrees Celsius. Okay? So, that's pretty hot. 2,500 degrees Celsius is 4,500 degrees. $4,500. The 1,200 degrees Celsius, I guess I need to look, what is that? It's way, 1,200 degrees Celsius is way above 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Aluminum melts at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so, and this up here gets up to 4,500 degrees on an average. So we've got a machine floating around. Of course, we know what solar panels are made out of, right? I mean, they're not fully metal. They've got like a coating on them, some kind of plastic coating. You mean to tell me this hunk of junk is flying around up there in 4,000? And let's come down a little bit just to be generous. Let's be generous. 3,000 degrees. Okay, let's knock the Celsius off and just call it Fahrenheit. 2,500 degrees. I mean, we're being really generous here because it goes all the way up to 4,500. 2,500 degrees is what this thing's flying around in. Aluminum melts at 1,200 degrees. Turns into liquid. But it doesn't. It doesn't for NASA. That's the beautiful thing about NASA. Okay? All the rules and regulations and rules as far as rules of thermodynamics, properties of chemicals, that kind of stuff, all that stuff, none of it applies to NASA. Only to us. So if I take a piece of aluminum and I heat it up to 4,000 degrees, it will melt and it will run away because it's a liquid now. If NASA takes a piece of aluminum and puts it up in outer space and heats it up to 4,000, It works for 20 years. It's great. It's wonderful. I mean, I don't know how they do it. Well, common sense ought to tell you how they're doing it. They're not doing it. Does that make sense? I mean, they're doing it because they're not doing it. It's fake. Okay? So, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end this one up today. This, again, is part 1. I'll go over some more of the stuff in part 2. I've covered most of it here, but I have a whole lot more to cover as far as the satellites and about their orbiting and some other stuff that just doesn't make any common sense whatsoever. So, if you're interested, tune back in for part 2. Thanks for listening, and God bless you.